Hey everyone, welcome to the next video. In this video, we'll talk about variables and data types. Let's get started. Back in our Python script where we left off, close our terminal and go ahead and delete everything in our Python script. So let's go ahead and drop down and create a variable. We already did this once where we set x equal to 1, right? But variables in Python need to be descriptive. Right now, since we're just starting out, x as a variable is fine. But in the future, a variable name should be something that actually makes sense. This could be something like age, maybe name, or something along those lines. Right now, let's go ahead and use the age variable. The first thing about variables is that we should type them with lower cases. Here, I put age with a lowercase instead of age with an uppercase. With the capital A, this may confuse people that have been using Python for a while because we tend to leave the capitalization to the class objects. Let's go ahead and change this to age with a lowercase, and this is now a variable. The cool thing about Python is that we don't actually have to explicitly state what type of variable we have. All we have to do is type in what we want this variable to equal. You already saw how we set the last variable x equal to 1. We can do the same thing with age here. So let's save our file, and then we'll drop down and use the print function again. And now let's introduce a new function. Let's use the type function, and then we'll pass in the variable that we want to this function. We'll say age here. What the type function does is it returns the data type of the variable that we passed to it. Let's open up our terminal again and type in python3 example.py. Make sure you have your file saved, and then we'll hit execute. And now we see that we returned a class of an integer. Python has a lot of different data types, but let's just talk about 3 main ones right now. Integers are just positive or negative whole number values. Here, since 1 doesn't have a decimal place, it's an integer. If we were to change this to 1.5 and execute our script again, our class now changes to a float. A float is just any number that includes a decimal point. Lastly, let's talk about how we can make a string. Instead of typing in a number, let's put in something called a delimiter, which can either be a double quotation mark or a single quotation mark, and then we'll pass in text. Drop down and executing, and we see that we now have a string class. This is something that a lot of beginners really enjoy about Python. We didn't need to denote anything other than what we wanted the value to be for a variable. In other programming languages, you would typically have to state what type this value is whenever you assign it to this variable. In Python, it does all the heavy lifting for us and automatically places a type to this value. This can get us in trouble sometimes though, because what if we want a float number and Python thinks it's an integer value? Let's drop down and say number. We'll set this equal to the number 1, but let's say that we wanted this to be returned as a float number instead of an integer value. We could just use something called casting in Python. What we'll do is we'll say float and then use it as a function and pass in what we want to be a float number. Now, instead of this returning as an integer, it should return as a float type. We'll drop down and say print, type, and then number. When we execute, we see that we're given a float, even though the default behavior in Python would have been an integer. We have access to do this with string, int, and also float. Lastly, let's talk about how we should create multi-word variables in Python. Let's drop down and say number, and then for the second word, we should put in an underscore to separate the two words. So number, and then let's say and age. We'll set this variable equal to a tuple, which we'll talk about later on in the course, and we'll say number and age. Now we can drop down and print number and age. When we do this, we get the return of both of these in a tuple to our terminal. Don't worry if you don't quite understand this tuple yet. We'll talk about that later on. What we should take away from this lesson is that variables can be uppercase, but we should keep them lowercase and separate multi-word variables using an underscore. We also have access to a lot of different data types, and we're able to explicitly state those data types using casting only if we want to. Lastly, Python makes it very easy for us to create variables because it automatically assigns a type depending on the value of the variable. If you got all this, you're good to move on to the next lesson. We'll talk about composite data types. I'll see you then.